And you can feel free to interrupt me at any time, given there's just a small number of us, but I'll just presentation as planned.
Okay.
All right, so, well, let me go back first. I guess it's on the flyer, but I serve as the Research Integrity Officer for the university. There are also counterparts in TEAS and in the other agencies that I work with as well. Obviously, there are significant costs of research misconduct. I just have them listed here. There are financial costs. In some of these investigations, the cost can be like in the six figures. There's also institutional reputations that are potentially damaged. Repayment of sponsored funds. Increasingly, this is becoming more of an important area as both the NIH and NSF and other federal agencies are taking a very stern perspective towards all sorts of research misconduct. It also entails the loss of faculty and researchers, as there are different sanctions, and I'll just go through them so people's careers actually can be derailed, and ultimately public safety concerns. These are the potential consequences to individuals, and this depends upon the type of research misconduct, and also what is referred to as the scope. So an individual that has found to have committed plagiarism in a very isolated case would receive different sanctions than someone that showed a pattern of, say, data falsification across, multiple years, right? So there's a consideration of that context. And so it can range from things like education to retractions or reprimands, like removal of people from projects, again, returning funds to funding agencies. There's also part of the process involves when there is federal funding involved that the agencies themselves do a review, and they can have additional sanctions that are imposed, or and sometimes these include not being eligible to apply for federal grants for ever or for a period of years, and obviously reputational harm and could be the end of a career. So dismissal is also a possibility in significant cases. This is just a historical context, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but it's just interesting that the attention to research misconduct, I guess because I'm old, when I think about the 80s and 90s, it doesn't seem that long ago, but the first congressional hearings really emerged as a result of data falsification and fabrication, which I will go into the definitions and give some examples later, in the context of medical and biomedical research. So there was clear public safety concerns at that time, and so there was a lot of attention given to this topic. But the first policies were not developed until the late 80s, and then we have training requirements. But it's not until we get to the 2000s where we have what today are the requirements for responsible conduct of research training. And these things are being modified all the time. And I would say the modifications are not for the requirements of institutions to be lessened, but rather that they be tightened. And all institutions that receive federal funding are required to have research misconduct policies. And these are essentially the requirements that we establish definitions, we have procedures for reporting and processing, and that there are individuals that are designated to receive and investigate. So those are the people like me. Then there's some other provisions that have to do with reporting, but the policies that we have in place at our institution are virtually the same as other institutions that receive federal funding. So there's a lot of commonality in the process, which, it is a good thing. These are this is the process and the key players. So we get receipts of allegations. There is a preliminary assessment phase. There is an inquiry that follows on the assessment. And I'll go into this a little bit more detail, I believe, in the next slides, but very quickly, and then I can skip over those slides if I don't need to. The goals of each of these steps in the process are very different. So the preliminary assessment phase is really just to establish whether or not this falls within the definition of research misconduct. And then if it does, there's an inquiry phase, which is really not to determine at all whether research misconduct has occurred, but really to delve down to gather more evidence to make a stronger determination of whether this needs to be investigated. And at the investigation phase, that's really the only point in the process where the allegations are really investigated so that we can address, is there intent, who's responsible, and was it committed? And then again, there's the potential independent investigation if it involves federal funding. And sometimes an institution can determine that it doesn't, that it's not research misconduct, but the federal agency may say, well, actually, we disagree based upon our assessment. So this process takes a long time. And again, that's one of the reasons it costs money. One of the things that I wanted to highlight here is we have rules and regulations that are available for people to review. But what's really important is our understanding that anybody that's aware of possible misconduct has an obligation to report it, right? That's really fundamental to this whole process, is reporting. And one of the issues that often arises in these investigations or in these reporting is that people will report it to their, say, department head, who then takes on the responsibility of investigating the allegation. And that is actually a misstep in the process and causes difficulty later on if we need to go back and kind of take over. So it is not the responsibility of other people to assess the credibility of these allegations, but rather to report them to the research integrity officer. So what are the definitions? They're actually pretty darn narrow. So not everything that's unethical falls under the umbrella of research misconduct, but there are three main categories. There is data fabrication, which basically is making up your data, falsification, manipulating your data so that it doesn't really reflect the research record, and of course, plagiarism, the appropriation of another person's ideas. So let me just go into these a little bit more. I wanted to point out the definition as well includes these kind of parameters. One of the difficulties in assessing is to establish that whatever is being whatever the allegation is that it's a significant departure from the accepted practices of the discipline, because disciplines vary a lot, and we'll talk about that in authorship. And so really part of the assessment and then the other parts of the process means that you have to draw on people with a similar disciplinary background and expertise because of those differences. And the other thing is that unlike a court of law, it does not have to be established without a reasonable doubt. It's only established by preponderance of evidence, which someone described as, 50% likely plus a feather, right? So it's not without a reasonable doubt. And it's not a bunch of other things like noncompliance or misuse of funds. When those types of allegations are brought to a RIO, the RIO would send them to the appropriate office based upon whatever, the parameters there were. It's not honest or unintentional error. It's not just a mistake, right? People make mistakes. But this little chart here, which comes from NSF, highlights one kind of area that people sometimes don't appreciate in terms of culpability, which is reckless. And knowing, you are doing something and knowing it's intentional, that's kind of easy to grasp because you're considering, the individual ought to have known and, clearly demonstrated intent. And I'll show you how that's done. So there's some awareness, but reckless is not based upon in the individual standard. It's a reasonable person standard. So what does that mean? The example that I found useful is if you were going through a school zone and you were speeding and you get pulled over, the police officer is not going to say or accept, oh, I wasn't aware, I didn't see the sign, because a reasonable person in that situation would have noticed things like, oh, there's a school there. Oh, there are children. Oh, there was a sign flashing, right? So even if you say, I actually didn't notice that, that would not excuse you from your responsibility. And in a lab situation, it's similarly being dismissive of cues or signs in the research environment that a reasonable person would have said, oh, this is not appropriate, right? So somebody not keeping good records, or seeing somebody manipulate, but just maybe not paying attention, and then not following up on things. So reckless, again, is a category that's sometimes difficult to appreciate, but one that's increasingly used by federal agencies. And this is just the gradual progression. This comes from a European journal, but again, it just highlights that, most of us are at the bottom, engaged in responsible conduct of research. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's just questionable, right? These questionable research practices, being sloppy, p hacking, things like that. They actually fall outside of scientific or research misconduct. It's just those three things. And we think fabrication, that making up of data, is probably the rarest based upon what we know from surveys and things. But again, the idea is where most of us are at the bottom, there's a slippery slope perhaps up to that tippy top. In some European countries, they're moving down the bar so that research misconduct will include these questionable research practices, but that is not our policy at this time. Okay, what are these things? This is actually a recent data, well, it's a recent ongoing case. Those are sort of redundant, but fabrication is a binary construct, right? You're making up your data or you're not. And in this example, and you probably can't read all the numbers, and that's not so important, but what's interesting about this data set, the evidence of fabrication, in the red where you have these identical numbers, and in the yellow where you just have one digit in the number changed in the post-treatment condition. And this was in some, I don't want to say it was fruit flies, or it's some small animal model of something or other. But this is the type of thing that they would look at. What's interesting too that I find is they use a lot of algorithms, which so computer learning software, when there are allegations of data fabrication that go up further, they have things like the proximity of numbers on the keyboard, because when you're entering fake data, you tend to use numbers that are close together to where your digits are, you're on your hand. So if you're doing 2 and 3, you're going to get what 7 and 8 are closer together than they would be in a normal circumstance. So there's lots of ways that are being used now, or to kind of consider this. But this is pretty obvious. There's fabrication. This person was a rising star, has now actually lost their doctoral degree. This is in Canada, and it's sort of in the news now, but was what was called the Canada Chair, which is like a really prestigious, long-lasting research award. And so career jeopardized by these types of research misconduct. In contrast, falsification is fuzzy, right? It's just making up your data, you're manipulating things, you're omitting, you're cherry picking, right? That's falsification. My internet is unstable, just so you know. But cherry picking your data, right, means that the end product doesn't reflect what was actually collected. So that's falsification. It's more prevalent, it seems, in NIH type funded research. I'll give you an example. Whereas there are other types associated with, say, NSF funding. But this is an example of falsification. So altering the date of a protocol to make it fit within the window of eligibility. And you don't have to read all the things except to note that in the true record, the patient was scanned on 3/26/05, but in the falsified data set, the dates were altered, so it made it appear as if that individual was scanned on 6/3/05, which was in the window of eligibility, right? So they're fudging things to make it fit within something, in this case, the eligibility window, so the record doesn't reflect the data, or the outcome doesn't reflect the research record. I have people say, well, what about examples in my field? This is retractionwatch.com. If you're interested in lots of these cases, they post them. This is a recent one where an education researcher has now 21 papers retracted because of concerns about the validity of the data. So data falsification in his work with children with special needs, right? So no discipline is immune to these occurrences. Plagiarism is something we think we understand really well because it's something that we are taught to avoid, and appropriate, how to reference people's ideas. But it's actually quite problematic. And this is one thing that granting agencies are very quick to identify, because they run their grant proposals through software like Authenticate. It's a little bit like a higher level version of what's used on student papers. And they can look at duplication of text. Verbatim plagiarism, therefore, is very easy to see when someone is like copying big chunks, and the actual act of copying and pasting and integrating it into a document is evidence of intent, right? You don't just accidentally copy and paste. People have come back and said, oh, I meant to go back and I meant to like modify this. And this was an error. That doesn't hold any weight with federal agencies these days. And certainly in an assessment that would involve the sequestration of documents, you would be able to tell whether or not there had been some later versions that didn't get submitted, or whether there was some attempt to provide referencing, right? So it's something, and oftentimes where this occurs in grants is in the introduction, where you're just covering the background material, and people go, well, it actually wasn't anything to do with what I was proposing, it was just this background. And again, that's irrelevant. Plagiarism, verbatim plagiarism is viewed very harshly. One of the things I did want to mention is authorship disputes. Sometimes you have people that are involved in a collaboration that at some point there is a disagreement about who owns or who should be an author on the paper. What's interesting about this, even though you might think, okay, well, this, someone's publishing a paper without my name on, but these are my ideas, that would be a clear, case of plagiarism, taking someone's ideas. It's actually difficult to establish when there is a collaborative relationship. And so the Office of Research Integrity does not view this as plagiarism in all cases. In fact, in most cases, they view this as an academic affair, because the reasoning is when you have people who are working together and exchanging ideas, ownership is really it is impossible to establish. So unless there is some record that's really clear that this belonged to me, as there is in verbatim plagiarism, it's referred to in this case, it would be our new Faculty Affairs Office. This was an example of a high-profile education researcher who has had papers retracted and corrected for plagiarism and misuse of references. Again, cut and paste and integration is intent. So plagiarism, an example there. And I wanted to give you one that's a little bit just as an example. A lot of what is plagiarized that involves images occurs in the biomedical field. And in those instances, images are often manipulated. So this was just an example based upon a Facebook post. So on the left-hand side is my Facebook post. And then a few days later, one of my Facebook friends from way back posted what looked to me like a similar picture, except it was cropped, right? The moon above Venus. And I'm looking at that and going like, gosh, is that really my picture? And so what I did, just because I had just come back from a boot camp on image manipulation, is I did some basic image manipulations using changing the gradients. And this is the type of thing they do to images to pull out sort of information that's not available to the naked eye. And in doing so, you could see, and I have arrows, that there are this is the hidden cloud cover that could not be seen. So you can see that these images are essentially identical because of those very, very, distinct patterns of cloud cover. And it's all. So this would be an example if this was a research, figure, where it would be clear to say who, what, and then the intent. Who, the person that copied it, what, plagiarism, and their intent in cropping it down to hide most of the identifiers would be used as evidence of their intent. Just a few more. This is an article. I used to be an editor of a journal, and this came to me. It was an article that was published before I was the editor, and everything in yellow is verbatim text from a article that the author published previously. So every word here that was from a different article. And the irony is that the paper was on ethical authorship. And they talked about it's important to recognize when people are doing this, to be vigilant, to use tools like Turnitin and quickly and appropriately punish people that engage in this behavior. Usually I ask people at this time, is this plagiarism? But just for time's sake, I won't do a poll, but most people think, yes, this is plagiarism. It is actually doesn't fall under the definition that we use for plagiarism because it's self-plagiarism, right? You're just using your own ideas. It's unethical. And in this case, there was a retraction, but the retraction was based on copyright violations, right? So when you submit a paper, you say it's not been published elsewhere. So it's an example of where there's a lot of, plagiarism, self-plagiarism, text recycling. It is unethical, but it would not fall under the definition of research misconduct. Okay, and this is just why we do training, but I know I want to keep room for questions, so I'm just going to move on. But obviously training being the thought is that once you know about what the definitions are, then you can protect yourself from engaging in that behavior. Jeff wanted me to talk about authorship and peer review, really because a lot of the, authorship disputes are not uncommon, and they come across even my desk quite a bit these days. And even though they fall outside of research misconduct, they cause a lot of distress, and it's important to understand how to avoid them. And again, it falls under ethical writing. We have avoiding plagiarism and then ethical authorship. This is an Office of Research Integrity document that's no longer available, but I'll talk about these unethical authorship processes next. But just as an example, that the Office of Research Integrity really takes these elements very seriously, even though they do not fall under the definition of research misconduct. This is an example that I use when we have the postdocs and graduate students. And just in a nutshell, it's a graduate student who's been working in a lab, collecting the data or doing the experiments, and then finds out they're not listed as first author. And so they say the first author person is a senior person, but they've been off doing things and not being involved in the actual running of the experiments. And this person's deciding, well, I'm not going to be in research anymore. I want to be going into industry. Can I, go and ask to be first author? And is this ethical? And of course, it's always ethical to talk about authorship and the role in authorship. But what this little narrative case example highlights, or is intended to highlight, is how important it is to establish the guidelines for authorship at the beginning of a project. We hear this all the time, but we rarely do it. Because they differ again by disciplines and labs. So for example, in this case, the student that was first author may have generated the idea, right? May have actually come up with this novel methodology. And the person that's saying, I did all the work, might have provided more technical assistance. In some disciplines, just doing technical stuff might give you an acknowledgement, and that would be appropriate. In other disciplines, you might be included as an author. But understanding what it means to be first author or senior author is often not communicated to students. And so there's a lot of tension and heartache that is unnecessary as a result. The rules, of course, there's increasing attention to authorship, and these arrangements should be formulated early on. And again, the failure to establish them does result in an increased incidence of authorship dispute. The guidelines, if you are submitting to journals these days, you've encountered them. They were first established by the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, but they've become pretty mainstream, where they list out the criteria, and you, when you submit, must identify the roles that different people have served on the journal as a way to justify them being an author, right? And so these guidelines are just listed there, but again, I'm sure you've encountered them. Whether or not people are implementing them or replying honestly when they're listing this is a different matter, but they're there to encourage responsible authorship. And we have policies which basically say the same, that the role of the lead author is to establish, the guidelines and to make sure that the people that are on the manuscript or the whatever publication are people that deserve to be there, and that this is consistent with the norms of the discipline. And this as an example, I am first author on this physics paper only because I was invited to write a small section on kind of human behavior. There is a Nobel Prize winning author on it, but in this journal, people are listed in alphabetical order. So Alexander just happened to be the first one in that alphabetical order. And so I'm first, but I certainly, in my discipline, would not merit to be in that position, right? So there's has to be the sensitivity to the norms of the journal or the discipline. And again, this is what I've said, I'll skip this. I wanted to talk about improper practices because this is something that is getting also a lot of attention. So ghost, not including an individual who contributed to the research. So I did a lot of work, it was my idea, but I'm not on it. But more often what we see are things that we refer to as gift or guest, including an individual who did not contribute to the research. Also including an author without their consent. People go off and they'll put people on, they won't notify them. And that has resulted in a lot of retractions. And that's just one example. And you might say, well, what's wrong with being, I'm going to put you on my paper and then you'll put me on your paper and we'll both benefit because the CV will be enriched by those manuscripts being listed. And obviously there's the whole thing about not being honest about the role, but to the individual that's actually listed, there's a clear disadvantage as well, because by being listed on that manuscript, you are accepting responsibility. And I can think of at least one case where somebody was listed as a gift, sort of like, I'll put you on, and they did not have a role in the research, and the manuscript is being retracted because of duplication of images and a lot of other bad practices. And the individual saying, well, I actually didn't really do anything, is really kind of hard to accept for the investigation committees because of responsible authorship practices that we assume people are following, right? So it sometimes is actually going to hurt your career for accepting these things. I'm going to skip this one, but this just shows that this type of authorship fraud is probably the most prevalent unethical practice. And this is a guide for new researchers that published in 2003, so you're not so new now, but it's still a lot of relevant information. And then peer review. One of the early, there's just a few more things I'll say, but one of the early arguments against having research, responsible conduct of research training and was the idea that science is self-correcting. We don't need to have people monitor and investigate and process because we have peer review. But peer review depends upon a lot of things that aren't necessarily valid in the real world. So the idea that self-correction by this process occurs is proven not to be a very robust way to deal with research misconduct. There's lots of threats to the impartiality of reviewers, and I've just listed a few of them, and there's quite a bit of research on this. But underneath it is this idea that we apply these standards of excellence uniformly across our reviews, and that tends not to be the case. More and more too, there's fake peer review, which is a huge problem, where people will submit papers and then, sometimes what people would you recommend? And they'll recommend people that actually look legit, but their emails are fraudulent. And so manuscripts are really not undergoing peer review. They're actually being reviewed by either paid people or friends. And again, you can see some of the headlines here from Retraction Watch. It's a very serious issue. And the other one that I wanted to mention is NIH's peer review confidentiality guidelines. They're really coming down hard on this. There's a case recently of somebody who had their graduate students do the reviews, and that was viewed by NIH as a gross violation of the confidentiality agreement, and the sanctions included them never serving as a peer reviewer. And restrictions on submissions. So NIH these days is becoming even more restrictive than NSF. I did want to mention, when I said there are discipline differences, the most common research misconduct case that is reported by NSF is plagiarism, the verbatim plagiarism. And one understanding is that it might reflect the types of individuals in these different disciplines, their backgrounds. For example, there are more people where English is not the first language applying for NSF funding, and they may be more vulnerable to using that, not realizing that it's research misconduct. But it's like something like 80% of their cases are plagiarism. Whereas if you look at NIH, like the vast majority are falsification and fabrication. So when we are peer reviewers, we are responsible for assessing quality, doing it timely, providing constructive feedback, being free from personal bound, and above all, maintaining confidentiality. And I think I want to see my time. Okay, I did whip through that really quickly, but I think that's it. Okay, so I know there are questions. You're just a small group, so I just wanted to do this very, succinctly. And now I welcome your questions about any of these topics or things that I haven't addressed.
Well, I have some questions that were
Yay.
emailed in prior to the coffee chat. So I think you've already addressed the first one. First question was how to address authorship when faculty disagree.
Yeah, so I can elaborate a bit on that, because we actually I created, because these are not unusual, I created a document that sort of summarizes the unethical research practices and then talks specifically about authorship disputes. And I can forward that to your office. And it talks about, depending upon whether you're a graduate student or you're a research staff or faculty, sort of the path to follow. And again, it's really the academic dispute type path for all of these. In the process of, say, the ombuds grads person reviewing these things, if they identify what they think are credible indications of plagiarism, it can still get referred to me. But the first path is really through the academic matter kind of path. But I'll send you that one pager.
Perfect. We'll have it for any faculty that would like to email us, and we'll get it out to them.
Yeah, and a lot of it really, the prevention is establishing the criteria up front, right? And again, it's everybody has heard this, but we don't often do it.
Well, sometimes it's just assumed, I think.
Yes.
Okay, can I have a question?
Mhm.
I'm Zora Islami. I'm from, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes.
Okay, from educational psychology. And I wanted to ask you, there are times that you may send a paper with a student or the student sent it with you, and it was checked for plagiarism by, say, the authors, the students, and it didn't detect any plagiarism. But then the journal editor, without sufficient evidence, claims that this has been plagiarized. And of course, so how would you handle that situation? Would you, contest it, or would you just let go and see what they are saying? Because sometimes, what is exactly plagiarism? Let's say there is a prototypical example that a lot of authors use in order to illustrate a point, and that example has used in 100 papers, let's say. So the fact that you use the same example and it shows it's exact example. So these are like, contentious issues. So how would you approach that as a PhD student working with your mentor if a journal editor responded as such?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is that sometimes people will run their manuscripts through the Turnitin.
Mm-hmm.
That is not a very robust database. And editors use a different software that's called Authenticate. And it has access to, for example, all the things that are posted on the internet. And I can say that when I was a journal editor, it was routinely done, and there would be different scores, right, that were based upon the percentage of overlap. And it's fairly common among journal editors to have some sort of threshold because of the things that you've talked about, right? Mm-hmm. And especially in an empirical paper describing a task, it's really hard to describe a measure or a task very differently. So there's usually a contextual kind of appreciation of the overlap in text, if that's what it is. The editor usually would not know if there was overlap of ideas, right? That would usually come from a reviewer who would say, hold it, I submitted this paper to this journal, it was rejected, and now this manuscript is basically plagiarizing what I did. And right, that is less common. So the answer then would be to have the editor clarify the nature of the allegation, right? Because there can be many different sources of, in terms of what that's describing. That would be the first step.
Mm-hmm. And can we as faculty members have access to this authentication for plagiarism, or can we just use Turnitin? If I want to submit a paper with my students, what are
I wouldn't use Turnitin at all. Yeah, yeah. So Turnitin, my connection is unstable. It's a narrow database, but you can open an account and authenticate. And I think there's like, I want to say it's like $100 for maybe 3. And then if you are revising it, if you find significant overlap, it doesn't, it doesn't count. At this time, the university doesn't have that software purchased. Yes, you can just, it's called Authenticate, like with the letter I. It's the same company that does Turnitin, but it might be something that your college wants to, yes, authenticate. You can, your college wants to do a graduate advisor if this is something that seems to be an issue. But at this time, we don't have it. We might be getting this at an institutional level at some point, because we would like to allow people submitting grants to run it through, because having it come back is, not a good thing.
Okay, thank you. Do we have anything else except Turnitin at the institutional level?
No.
Okay.
Not to my knowledge. And again, it's an insufficient tool.
Okay,
And for student papers and stuff like that, but not for a journal submission or a grant submission.
thank you.
Other questions? Jim?
I have two more.
Yay.
Question number 2 that was submitted is how to ensure fairness of author attribution when there is a power differentiation, e.g. a student believes their contribution is greater than what is decided or assigned in the hierarchy of authorship attribution, which is kind of like the example that you gave. But if somebody is facing that, a faculty member is facing that, or a graduate student is facing that, to whom would they go?
The ombuds person. Well, I think they would, I would refer them to the ombuds because that individual, and so the graduate school has an ombuds person. I mean, you might say, well, you could go talk to the chair or, but sometimes graduate students feel like, oh, like I don't want it to get like it's tangled up in my department and I want to feel like I can speak freely. And, there's lots of reasons where they might feel more comfortable talking to a person that's not affiliated with their department. And so in that case, the ombuds is there to serve them. But that's, and one of the things the graduate school tried to establish early on was the compact, but there was so much pushback from faculty at that time and that it never flew. But really it has a lot of things that are very desirable about it. And I think it's available. I could also send that to you as well. It's really nice because it outlines the expectancies of advisors of graduate students. Like this is how, if there's time you need to be in the lab, this is what I expect, this is how authorship works, And it's a living document. It can be changed. But some people did not feel comfortable having things written down, which I think why are you uncomfortable? Right? I mean, if it's, so I can send that to you as well. I've had to use it in myself in my different role and found it to be useful.
Okay, I have one more question, which I think you're going to like. Is question number 3 regarding research misconduct.
Yes.
Are there anonymous ways to report research misconduct for those who are concerned about retaliation or power differentiation regarding the individuals who are considered as engaging in misconduct? E.g., a graduate student observes a clear violation of misconduct by a person on their committee who has a voice as to whether they will pass their dissertation defense.
Right. So one of the things that the policy includes, because it's protections of the whistleblower. And early on, one of the first cases when, and it wasn't an undergraduate, it was another faculty member reported this, case, which ultimately was like this huge data falsification, fabrication case, reported it, and they themselves were the subject of like investigation, right? Like, you must have something, so we're going to investigate you. And because of that, there's been there's a lot of language in our policy that speaks to that. So regarding anonymous, I mean, a person can contact me. We preserve confidentiality, to the full extent that we're allowed to by the law. They need not be identified. There's also ethics point, which is a way for people to report different ethical concerns. And as much as possible, we accommodate requests for confidentiality. Sometimes that's not possible when you have two people that are arguing about a particular thing, and they are, it's clear that like two people, I mean, their names can't be always hidden, but a lot of times the reporter, the complainant doesn't need to be known, right? Because it could be anybody in the lab. Or anybody in. So I would just encourage them to contact me or report it. It will come to me anyway. And there's the assessment phase, as I said, it's really just determining whether or not the allegation falls within the definition and whether it's specific and credible. Because the other thing in terms of protections is we want to protect people from, someone just saying, I think this person's making up all their data, right? Like, I just don't like this person. So like, that's not specific and enough, right? But that doesn't happen very often, but there are protections for both the respondent and the complainant in our policies.
Okay. Do we have any more? I'm out of questions. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask? We have time.
I could say I did the, most recently, I did a boot camp with the Office of Research Integrity that was really, really helpful. And it's just amazing how many, like most of what we have seen, I mean, very little, but a lot of institutions with huge medical schools, like they are very busy. And there's a lot of really interesting software out there for looking at, like with Adobe Photoshop, there's all sorts of things people do. There's a whole world of forensic analyses. One of the first things we do, though, and I didn't mention, is sequestration. So that means we have people on campus that can go in and just copy everything on a person's computer, right? And if it goes to inquiry, so data is collected very, very quickly and early on in the process. And that's why it makes things like someone saying, well, I didn't submit my correct version, like those things are fairly easy to establish, right? So, but yeah, it's like, I like mysteries and always liked, and I am a psychologist, as many of you are. So it's sort of an interesting area to be serving in. Anyway, well, email with any questions, and I encourage your students and faculty to reach out. Our goal is just to educate as much people as possible, because oftentimes people really don't understand, what they're doing is may come back to bite them very hardly, and also the responsibilities to report it, because we want to protect ourselves and our institution.
Dr. Alexander, we are very grateful for your time today. We know how busy you are, and we're very grateful that you could share this important, critical information with us.
Oh, thank you, Jim.
And also, this presentation has been recorded, so we'll be able to make it available to folks who were not able to make today's meeting. My colleague Ann Savell is in charge of that, and she can make sure that gets where it needs to go so people can access it on their own schedule. But again, thank you so much. We very much appreciate your time.
Okay, and I'll forward those documents to you. I'll forward to you, Ann, so you have them.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.